Welcome to the Royal Red. This channel explores the royal families of Europe through quiet, story-driven history, while showing you beautiful images of medieval architecture. Our videos are available in both English and Spanish. If you wish to listen to the Spanish translation of this video, the link is in the description. If you enjoy learning through calm storytelling, and if you enjoy history that focuses on people, families, and human choices, you are warmly invited to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Think of it as investing in your future peace of mind, and please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps this quiet project continue. Now, take a moment to relax, take a seat, or lie down. Allow yourself to unwind by the royal fireplace, and let today's story begin. In the early morning of June the 20th, in the year 1819, a child was born inside Kensington Palace in London. Her name was Alexandrina Victoria. She was not born to be queen, at least not in anyone's original plans. At the time, the British royal family was large. There were many princes, many uncles, many possible heirs. Victoria was only the daughter of a younger son of the king. Her father was Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent. He was the fourth son of King George III. In simple terms, Victoria stood very far from the throne. No one celebrated her birth as the arrival of a future monarch. She was simply a small royal child in a crowded family. But history, very quietly, was already changing around her. Only 8 months after Victoria was born, her father died. He was only 50 years old. Victoria would never remember him. From that moment on, her life became much smaller. She grew up with her mother, the Duchess of Kent, in carefully controlled surroundings. Her world was quiet. Her days followed strict rules. She had lessons. She had tutors. She had schedules. And she had almost no freedom. Her childhood would later be remembered for a system that historians now call the Kensington system. It was designed to keep her safe, but it also kept her isolated. Victoria was rarely allowed to be alone. She was rarely allowed to make her own choices. Every movement was watched. Every friendship was carefully selected. Even as a child, her life already belonged to the future. Slowly, the royal family around her began to shrink. One by one, the older heirs died. Uncles who once stood between Victoria and the crown disappeared from the line of succession. Without anyone announcing it clearly, the small, controlled life of a quiet girl became something much more serious. She was becoming important. She was becoming necessary. By the time Victoria was a teenager, the truth could no longer be hidden. One day, she would become queen. But no one truly prepared her for what that meant. She was educated. She learned languages. She studied history. She learned how to behave as a royal. But she was not trained to rule. Power, real power, was still kept at a distance from her. It was something that belonged to men, to ministers, to older, experienced figures, not to a young woman raised in silence and obedience. And yet, everything would soon change. In the early hours of June the 20th, 1837, exactly 18 years after her birth, Victoria was awakened in her bedroom. Two important men were waiting for her, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain. They had come with a simple message. Her uncle, King William IV, had died during the night. Victoria was now queen. She later wrote that she was taken by surprise, not because she did not expect it to happen one day, but because it happened so suddenly, so quietly, so early in the morning. She was only 18 years old. For the first time in her life, she was allowed to be alone. She was allowed to walk without being watched. She was allowed to sit in her own room without supervision. One of her first requests as queen was simple. She asked for an hour of privacy. After a childhood without independence, it was her first small act of personal freedom. But the freedom she had gained came with something much heavier: responsibility. An entire country now belonged to her decisions. And very quickly, another question began to follow her everywhere. Who would she marry? In the 19th century, a queen was rarely expected to rule alone. Marriage was not simply personal, it was political. A husband could bring alliances, influence, and power. For Victoria, this question was especially complicated. As queen, she could not be ordered to marry, but she could be pressured. Letters arrived from relatives across Europe. Suggestions were quietly shared. Possible husbands were carefully discussed. All of them came from royal families. All of them represented political connections. But Victoria was not easily convinced. She had been controlled for most of her life. Now, she was determined to make at least one important decision for herself. And that decision would be Albert, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He was her first cousin. They had met as teenagers. At first, their relationship was polite, formal, almost distant. But when Albert returned to Britain in 1839, something changed. Victoria fell in love. She later described him as gentle, kind, and deeply serious. For once, the choice was truly hers. As queen, she had to make the proposal herself, a tradition that still exists today. And so, in October of 1839, Victoria asked Albert to marry her. He accepted. They were married the following year. For Victoria, the marriage was deeply personal. But for Europe, it would quietly become something far more important. This was not simply a love story. It was the beginning of a family network that would spread across an entire continent. When Victoria married Prince Albert in February of 1840, London celebrated. The streets were filled with people. Church bells rang across the city. The young queen, dressed in white, walked slowly through the ceremony. It was one of the first royal weddings to be watched so closely by the public. But behind the crowds and the music, something much quieter was beginning. A private life, a shared routine, a marriage that would soon shape far more than one household. At first, life with Albert was not simple. Victoria was the queen. Albert was a foreign prince. He had no official political role. He had no real power. And in the carefully balanced world of the British court that created tension, Victoria loved him deeply, but love did not change the structure of the monarchy. Albert was expected to support her, to advise her, but never to lead. For a young man who had been raised to believe in duty, education, and public service, this was difficult. He was intelligent, organized, and deeply interested in reform. But for a long time, he remained on the edge of power. Slowly, however, his influence grew. Not through titles, but through trust. Victoria relied on him more and more. She read state papers with him. She discussed ministers with him. She shared her doubts and frustrations. Over time, Albert became her closest political partner. But their marriage was not only shaped by politics, it was also shaped by family. In November of 1840, less than a year after their wedding, their first child was born. a daughter. They named her Victoria. She would later be known as the Princess Royal. The arrival of their first child changed the rhythm of their lives. Very quickly, the household filled with new voices, new routines, and new responsibilities. Between 1840 and 1857, Victoria gave birth to 9 children, 5 daughters, and 4 sons. The royal residences became places of lessons and laughter, of tutors and nurses, of strict schedules and carefully planned family meals. Albert took a strong interest in the education of the children. He believed deeply in discipline, in languages, in history, in science. He wanted his sons and daughters to be prepared for serious lives, not only for ceremonial roles. Victoria, by contrast, was more emotional, more protective. She loved her children deeply, but often found motherhood exhausting. Her letters reveal moments of frustration, of loneliness, and of constant physical fatigue. Still, the family remained close. They spent long periods together. They walked. They played music. They read aloud. Behind the heavy curtains of palaces and castles, a very human family life was unfolding. But outside those walls, Europe was watching, because the children of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were not only sons and daughters, they were future alliances, future queens, future kings. Every birth quietly attracted attention across the continent. Courts in Berlin, in Copenhagen, in St. Petersburg, in Madrid, all understood what this growing family represented. Opportunity. In the 19th century, marriage was still one of the most powerful diplomatic tools. A wedding could secure loyalty, reduce tension, or reshape influence. Albert understood this better than almost anyone. He had grown up in a small German duchy. He knew how fragile power could be, and he knew how useful family connections were. Slowly, carefully, the future of each child began to be discussed, not in public speeches, but in letters, in private meetings, in long, quiet conversations between royal households. The eldest daughter, Princess Victoria, was the first to be prepared for a European future. From an early age, she was taught German. She studied Prussian history. She learned the customs of a country that was not her own. When she was only 16, she married Prince Frederick of Prussia. He was the future Emperor of Germany. For Victoria, the wedding was emotional. She was sending her child far away, but she also believed in the purpose of the marriage. It was meant to connect Britain and Prussia through trust and shared values. Their second child, Albert Edward, was the heir to the British throne. He would one day become King Edward VII. His future marriage would be watched even more carefully. The other children would follow. One by one, sons and daughters were quietly prepared for lives beyond Britain. They would speak different languages. They would live in unfamiliar courts. They would become part of other nations. To the public, these marriages were celebrated as symbols of unity, of peace, of shared royal culture. But within the family, there were personal losses as well. Children leaving home, parents watching them grow distant, letters replacing daily conversations. And yet, Victoria and Albert believed deeply in what they were building. They believed that a connected royal family could soften political conflict, that shared blood could encourage understanding, that cousins on different thrones would think twice before turning against one another. It was a hopeful idea, a gentle vision for Europe. but history would later test it in painful ways. For now, however, the family continued to grow. The royal nurseries became classrooms. The classrooms became preparation rooms for future courts. And slowly, without dramatic announcements or grand declarations, a web of royal relationships began to spread across Europe. At the very center of that web sat a small, tightly controlled household in Britain. A queen, a prince, and their children. By the middle of the 19th century, Queen Victoria's family no longer felt small. It had become wide, and slowly, unmistakably, it had become European. What had begun as a private household in Britain was now stretching across borders, languages and courts. The children of Victoria and Albert were growing older, and with every birthday, the same quiet question returned. Where would they belong? For each son and each daughter, marriage would not only decide a personal future, it would decide a political direction. The second daughter, Princess Alice, was among the first to leave home. She was gentle, serious, deeply compassionate. In 1862, she married Prince Louis of Hesse, a small German state in the center of Europe. The marriage was not to a powerful empire. It was to a modest court. But it was meaningful. Alice carried with her the values she had learned from her parents: education, responsibility, and a strong sense of social duty. She would later become known for her work with hospitals and wounded soldiers. Quiet service, not public glory. Soon after, another daughter followed. Princess Helena married a German prince, Christian of Schleswig-Holstein. Her marriage, though less politically dramatic, strengthened German connections even further. Then came Princess Louise. Unlike her sisters, she didn't marry a foreign royal. She married a British nobleman. For Victoria, this decision was unusual, but it was allowed. Not every child needed to serve diplomacy in the same way. Still, most of the family's future would be written beyond Britain. Princess Beatrice, the youngest daughter, remained closest to her mother. Victoria was reluctant to let her go. After the death of Prince Albert, Beatrice became her constant companion, but even she would eventually marry. Her husband, Henry of Battenberg, belonged to a German family connected to several European courts. And with that marriage, another branch of the royal family quietly extended into continental Europe. The sons followed similar paths. Prince Alfred married a Russian Grand Duchess, Maria Alexandrovna, the daughter of Tsar Alexander II. Through this single marriage, the British royal family became directly connected to the Romanovs of Russia, a connection that would later carry deep emotional meaning. Prince Arthur married a Prussian princess. Prince Leopold married a German princess. And the youngest son, Prince Albert Victor, died young before marriage. Only one son would remain firmly within Britain: Albert Edward, the future king. His marriage was one of the most carefully planned of all. In 1863, he married Princess Alexandra of Denmark. She was young, graceful, and deeply admired by the public. But her marriage also brought another powerful connection. Through Alexandra, the British royal family became linked to the Danish royal house, a family that already had close ties to both Russia and Greece. With that single wedding, another important bridge was quietly built. By the time Victoria reached old age, the map of Europe had become strangely familiar. In Germany, her daughter, and later her grandson stood close to the imperial throne. In Russia, her granddaughter married the future Tsar. In Greece, her grandson would become king. In Romania, another grandson would also take a crown. In Norway and Denmark, her descendants entered royal lines. And even in Spain, family connections slowly appeared. Almost every major royal court could trace a line back to London, back to Windsor, back to one family. It was not an empire. It was something softer, a network, a family web. Private letters moved constantly between courts, written in English, in German, in French. Victoria remained at the center of this correspondence. She followed pregnancies, births, engagements, illnesses, and political crises, not as a distant monarch, but as a mother, a grandmother, a matriarch. When one of her daughters suffered, when a grandson fell ill, when a marriage struggled, Victoria responded not with diplomatic language, but with deeply personal words, advice, comfort, sometimes quiet disappointment, sometimes open concern. For her, Europe was no longer a collection of foreign nations. It was a collection of relatives. But the world around this family was changing. The 19th century was not as peaceful as Victoria and Albert had once hoped. Nationalism was growing. Old empires were under pressure. Public opinion mattered more than royal connections. Parliaments gained influence. New political movements questioned the place of monarchy itself. And slowly, quietly, the power of shared blood began to weaken. Cousins could write affectionate letters, but they could not always control their governments. They could share childhood memories, but they could not always prevent conflict. The family continued to gather when possible, at weddings, at funerals, at jubilees. Old photographs captured large groups of carefully dressed relatives, standing close together, smiling politely, sometimes warmly. But beneath the surface, Europe was becoming more complicated, more divided, more restless. Still, Queen Victoria held firmly to the idea that family mattered, that personal bonds could soften political tension, that shared upbringing could create restraint. She had seen her children grow up side by side. She had watched cousins play together in palace gardens. In her mind, it was impossible to believe that these connections would ever truly disappear. And yet, history was already preparing a very different future. A future that would test every hopeful assumption behind this carefully built family network. In December of 1861, everything changed. Prince Albert became ill. At first, the sickness did not seem serious. The household continued its routines. Letters were still written. Meetings were still held. Life moved forward, quietly and carefully. But within days, it became clear that something was wrong. Albert was weak. He could not leave his bed. The doctors spoke in cautious, uncertain terms, and Victoria stayed beside him. For more than 20 years, Albert had been at the center of her life, not only as her husband, but as her closest advisor, her intellectual partner, her private support in a public world. On the 14th of December, Prince Albert died. He was only 42 years old. Victoria was devastated. The shock was immediate, and it was lasting. She withdrew from public life. She avoided ceremonies. She refused celebrations. She stopped appearing at court whenever possible. For many people in Britain, the young, energetic queen of the early years seemed to disappear. In her place remained a grieving widow. For the rest of her life, Victoria would wear black. Albert's rooms were preserved exactly as he had left them. His clothes were laid out each morning. His memory became part of the daily structure of the royal household. But while Victoria's world became smaller and quieter, her family continued to grow outward. Her children married. Her grandchildren were born. The web that she and Albert had imagined continued to spread. From a distance, Victoria followed every development. Through letters, through trusted advisors, through family visits when her health and strength allowed. Her authority no longer came from presence. It came from connection, from being the emotional center of a wide and complicated family. Slowly, almost without noticing, Victoria became something different. Not simply a reigning monarch, but a symbolic figure. A grandmother to kings, a grandmother to queens, a shared point of reference for Europe's royal houses. In 1887, she celebrated her Golden Jubilee. 50 years on the throne. Delegations arrived from across the world, but it was the family presence that quietly told the real story. Relatives filled the streets and palaces. Representatives of foreign courts stood beside her. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her. For a brief moment, it appeared that the royal network had succeeded, that peace, stability, and tradition could still be held together by family. 10 years later, in 1897, she celebrated her Diamond Jubilee, 60 years as queen. By then, she was very old. Her movements were slow. Her voice was weak, but her position was unmatched. Never before had a European monarch connected so many royal houses through direct family ties. At the heart of nearly every ceremonial gathering stood the same woman. Small, dressed in black, quietly observing a world that she had helped shape. But behind the celebrations, the world was moving in another direction. The great powers of Europe were becoming more suspicious of one another. Military alliances were hardening. National pride was growing sharper. New generations of politicians were less interested in royal family connections. They spoke a different language, a language of borders, of influence, of competition. Within Victoria's own family, subtle tensions could already be felt. Different courts expected different loyalties. Different nations demanded different priorities. And the grandchildren who had once played together now carried responsibilities shaped by their own countries. Victoria remained deeply involved in their lives. She advised. She worried. She intervened when she believed she could help. But even she could feel that her influence was limited. Affection did not always translate into political agreement, and family loyalty could not always outweigh national interest. The most painful proof of this change would come after her death. Victoria died in January of 1901. She was 81 years old. Her passing marked the end of an era. But her family remained, spread across Europe, holding crowns, signing laws, commanding armies. Within little more than a decade, many of her grandchildren would face one another across battle lines, and the sons and daughters of her carefully built family network would become leaders in a conflict that no family bond could prevent. Cousins would become enemies. private letters would give way to military orders, and the hope that shared blood could protect Europe from catastrophe would finally collapse. Yet history should not judge Victoria's vision too harshly. In her world, the monarchy still believed in personal responsibility, in a moral example, in the quiet influence of private relationships. She had lived through an age in which diplomacy was often conducted in drawing rooms and family visits, not only in parliaments and military councils. Her dream was not power, it was stability, it was continuity, it was a Europe held together by familiarity, by trust, by family. In the end, that dream could not survive the forces of the 20th century, but it left behind a remarkable legacy. A single woman, a single marriage, and a family whose branches reached into nearly every royal house in Europe. This is why history still remembers Queen Victoria, not only as a ruler, but as something far more personal, the grandmother of Europe. Thank you for listening to The Royal Red. We hope you've enjoyed today's story, and hope it's helped you relax and unwind after a long day. If you have any suggestions for our next story, please leave a comment